So that's our challenge. Keep cows healthy, give them the inputs of nutrition management, so on, that they need to set them up for success for repro.
So welcome everybody to this episode of the Dairy Podcast Show. My name is Gail Carpenter and I'm the State Dairy Extension Specialist for Iowa State University. I'm joined today by Dr. Stephen LeBlanc from the University of Guelph. Stephen is a professor in the Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College, and he's the director of Dairy at Guelph, the Center for Dairy Research and Innovation at the University of Guelph. He received a BSc in Agriculture and Animal Science from McGill University in 1992 and a DVM in 1997 and a DVSc in 2001 from the University of Guelph. After 5 years of private veterinary practice, he joined the faculty at the University of Guelph, where he teaches veterinary students and provides clinical farm service. He is a past president of the Dairy Cattle Reproduction Council and served 6 years as a section and senior editor for the Journal of Dairy Science. He is a director of the American Dairy Science Association. His research focuses on dairy cow metabolic and reproductive health and management, precision technologies, and antimicrobial stewardship. With graduate students and collaborators, this work has resulted in over 175 peer-reviewed papers, and he has given invited talks in 20 countries. Thank you for joining us today, Stephen. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks, Gail. I'm glad to be with you.
So I kind of want to get into topic today that I find, so I coach the Dairy Challenge team here, right? And a lot of times we have a tendency to go through our different units. And so we have our reproduction unit and our nutrition unit and our facilities unit and all this. And maybe other teachers teach the same way, I don't know. But I get a little bit frustrated sometimes with teaching, especially senior students who are kind of at the stage where they're putting everything together, right? They're putting together a whole package. And each of those things, each of our different units, we kind of tend to treat them like silos, but in reality on farm, everything kind of interacts with each other, right? You can't really just say repro is a thing on its own and mastitis is a thing on its own. Like everything kind of blends together a little bit, right? So something I want to get your perspective on a little bit is this interaction between reproduction and transition. So a lot of times when I'm working with a farm, looking at farm records or doing whatever else and focusing on, this farm has a low preg rate or isn't meeting their goals in preg rate. I think a lot of times the first place that I go, and maybe this is my bias because I'm a nutritionist and really enjoy the transition period, but a lot of times the first place I go when I'm looking at repro issues on farm is that transition period. Do you think that's real? Do you think how many reproductive problems on farm do you think tie back to a poor transition?
Probably a lot. So, you talked about fourth year students, still being at the stage of putting things together. Certainly fourth year vet students are the same way as fourth year Aggie students. And I would say that actually, even for professionals, whether they're university professors or professionals out in the field, I think we spend the rest of our professional lives trying to put things together. It's a never-ending process. But yeah, I would agree with you that transition cow health is, it's almost like a cliche, but it's absolutely the foundation of of everything, but in particular reproductive performance. So, if you think back, let's say even 20 years ago, I used to, somewhat jokingly do talks for farmers and other professionals about the number one reproductive disease of dairy cattle was semen deficiency. In that, we just weren't necessarily being very efficient about getting semen into cows. And between synchronization programs for timed AI and or activity monitors and or better facilities that allow for estrus expression, some combination of all those three things. There's lots of herds still have some miles to make there, but big picture, as an industry, we've come a long way there. And so efficiently getting cows inseminated is way better than it used to be. And it's totally within our grasp to take as much control of that as you need to achieve good success. And so then the driver becomes what some people refer to not as insemination management, but actual fertility management. And so making yards on conception risk or probability of pregnancy, or the success of each insemination, that's much harder. And there's a long list of stuff that goes into that. But practically, I would agree with you that if a farm isn't doing well with, having achieved some efficiency in getting semen into cows and back into cows in a timely way, if they've still got some ways to go on pregnancy per AI, setting cows up for success for that, especially at first service, but not only, has a lot to do with the transition period. I would even, I'll go one more quick mile, and that's one of my favorite data sets to make that point is the work that Jose Santos from Florida published about a dozen years ago. But long story short, they'd done a whole bunch of synchronized breeding trials, but along the way, using nearly 6,000 cows from high-producing, big, intensively managed herds in California, they were all about, this sink versus that sink, or sink versus not sink, and so on. But along the way, they kept really careful track of transition cow health for all these cows. And the couple big take-homes for me out of that were, any and just about every transition cow problem, metritis, mastitis, lameness, ketosis, pulled down pregnancy at first insemination. Surprise. But the two things that I thought were really compelling messages were, the sobering part was only just over half of cows made it through the transition period without experiencing at least one issue, condition, disease, if you were really keeping careful track. So that's the downer. But the real upside is, even in these really high producing cows, big herds, intensive management, the whole deal, pregnancy at first AI, and this was before, double OB-sync or sort of those Cadillac fertility programs, pregnancy at first AI in these cows was over 50%. So all of that to say that I think the take home is, if we keep cows healthy, number one, then they will be high producing. But even if they're high producing, the fertility has not left that, so that's our challenge. Keep cows healthy, give them the inputs of nutrition management, so on, that they need to set them up for success for repro. Yeah.
So what is the best predictor then of transition and reproductive success? So is it count of events? Is it metritis? Is it, any incidence of metritis? Is it milk fever? What is the best predictor in your opinion? Or not opinion, but...
I'll do my best to answer from data. So interestingly, because I'll come at that from two angles. Any clinical disease, especially uterine disease, mostly meaning metritis, also cows that don't clean, but any clinical disease, a DA, lameness, mastitis, etc., is going to be somewhat to fairly bad for that affected cow. Not fatal for fertility, but meaningfully, noticeably bad for that cow. So then it's a question of how prevalent are these things in a herd. Having a DA, very bad. Hopefully that's only 1 or 2% of your cows. So as a herd level thing, hopefully not a really big deal. Metritis, that's a whole other, we could spend a whole other podcast just on that, but treated metritis does still have an impact on fertility, although perhaps not terrible, but for the affected individual. But again, depending on the herd and so on, you're going to be probably 10 to even 20% of cows affected. So that starts to become important for the herd. And then if we go out to something like ketosis, where the effect for an individual cow is a little more equivocal, but it tends to be quite a high prevalence condition. 20, 30, 40% of cows will experience ketosis. Excuse me. So at least potentially that could start to become could become a meaningful thing at the herd level. So I guess, so the first big thing is, clinical or even subclinical disease, any and all of the biggies that I've mentioned, are going to be at least worth looking at in a herd. Do a bit of, good record keeping and or some testing to see where the herd's at, to make that herd specific decision. Like, is this probably a meaningful deal for us? Is this the next or a next thing for a given herd to spend time and money on? For instance, just to finish that thought, like there's tons of papers that show that cows that have mastitis before, near, or after insemination are less likely to get pregnant. But there's some really good work out of the UK from a few years ago that took that and put it in a much bigger context of a whole bunch of other variables. And the statistical associations are absolutely there. But if you put it in context of the bigger picture variables about insemination rate, conception risk, and some other much bigger things, the amount of variation in a herd's pregnancy rate that's explained by mastitis is actually really small. So does it matter to the cow? Yes. Does it matter to the herd? Maybe, but maybe not. So tracking of disease, a little bit of proactive looking for what are the opportunities, what are the bottlenecks on our herd, because it's not one size fits all. The other big one, though, that is, what's old is new again, is good old body condition score. So, 0 points for novelty, but there's actually in the last few years been some really compelling data sets to show that cows that don't lose much condition in the weeks after calving, or even gain condition, we used to think, well, those are lazy cows, so to speak. That's nice for them, but they're probably not making much milk. Well, to be continued on that, but not necessarily. And the part that's really compelling that we haven't really had good data on up until now is cows that maintain their body condition can have outstanding fertility. Now, some of that loops back to this angle of, who maintains their body condition? Well, there's a genetic piece to it for sure, but the flip side is if the cow goes lame, if the cow has a DA, if the cow has metritis, she's much, chicken and egg, but at the end of the day, she's much more likely to be a cow who loses and maybe loses quite a bit of body condition from calving till, 1 to 2 months postpartum. But again, that's easy to look at. And sometimes we have better data on that than we necessarily do on really thorough disease recording. So again, I think that's one that it is simple, but actually pretty compelling. And it seems from a few data sets from the US and elsewhere that maybe we can really have it all. Healthy cows don't lose a lot of condition. Cows that don't lose a lot of condition probably stay healthy. But looks like we don't necessarily have to give up on production either. And I think one of the big things that's changed there is having cows calve in leaner conditions. So aiming for cows calving around a body score of 3, 3.25. I personally wouldn't aim lower than that, because if you miss, you're really going to be offside. But again, I'm old enough, I won't make assumptions about you, but I'm old enough to remember when we thought it was a good, losing body condition was inevitable. And so we better start a little higher, knowing that the cow's going to lose and has to lose. Well, that's maybe changed a little bit, right? Like calving them in closer to a 3 and not a 375 looks to be a really good strategy.
Does that tie in? I've been hearing a lot more in general lately about this idea of resilience. Is that what this ties into? Just cows that stay healthy, keep milking, your low problem cows?
Yeah, that's a piece of it. Call it resilience, there's a really big research project in Europe that's trying to identify resilient cows. Some of my colleagues here at Guelph are part of leading a very multi-country, multi-university thing that's looking at the genetics of that, called the Resilient Dairy Genome. They have a website, you can look it up. But yeah, they're looking for all kinds of stuff from disease resistance to heat stress resistance to ultimately cows that are more, call them feed efficient, call them, more carbon neutral cows, in the sense that they just convert resources in a more efficient way. But yeah, yes to all of that. I mean, genetics is clearly a piece of that puzzle. My bias is that a lot of that is still down to management, giving cows the conditions to thrive. But yeah, at the end of the day, we're kind of mixing up all our favorite metaphors here, from resilience to the metabolic athlete. But I kind of like that one in the sense that, when we're asking a lot of cows, which we are, make a lot of milk, stay healthy, get pregnant, well, you got to support them to a commensurate level. So, some people use the race car analogy, right? If you're driving a race car, well, you don't just put any tires on it or any oil in it or any driver in it. You have to have all those pieces for that thing to work well. Whether you like that analogy or not, I think it's got something to say about dairy cows. That, yeah, if we're going to ask cows to, produce 100 pounds of milk a day and get pregnant 3 months after they last calved, their nutrition and management and everything has to just be right up at the top of the game.
Yeah, I also enjoy chirping geneticists a little bit sometimes, and saying what we do is more important. Of course, I think, like I said earlier, it's all important, right? And I think that you're doing yourself a favor on the management side if you're managing cows with a good genetic base. Like, it's a lot easier to manage those high achieving resilient cows versus managing cows with poor genetics. So, as much as I also like to show my biases and maybe tease geneticists a little bit, it's all important, right?
Absolutely. Yep. And again, as it like ratchets forward, right? As we do better and better managing, well, then the notion that we might be actually approaching genetic potential for some traits becomes more meaningful. And so all the more reason to, keep selecting and select better, so that we keep raising the bar, raising the ceiling, and then looping back to and keep raising the management game to make sure we're chasing or approaching that genetic potential.
Yeah, we have a really fast moving industry, that's for sure. I like you said, I'm not quite as old as you are. I think I was still in high school when you were finishing up. No, I hadn't even gotten to high school yet. Sorry, when you were finishing up vet school. But not to say anybody's older or younger, but even in the time that I've been in my career, I feel like we've just seen leaps and bounds when it comes to pregnancy rate, right? Like, what's the new stretch goal for preg rate? Because I wrote an article when I was not too long after I finished my PhD about farms that were, shooting for 30% preg rate, and that was like this big stretch goal at the time. And now, like 6 years later, I feel like I see a lot more farms that are achieving that. So what's the new stretch goal that farms are shooting for preg rate and repro benchmarks?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There was an economic and modeling exercise that was done by two professors at Penn, Jim Ferguson, Dave Galligan, it was published like in a conference proceedings in the late 90s, and they said, basically, it looks like the economic optimum 21-day preg rate would be around 35%. At the time, the population average was like 14, and that was just unheard of. I mean, that was like some kind of hypothetical thing. Well, that's a nice idea, but obviously that's unattainable. But let's just try to move in that direction. Well, and there was quite a long lag there through the 90s and early 2000s, where at the population level, preg rates really weren't. I mean, they were moving, but boy, you had to look hard to see it. And I think for a bunch of reasons, partially more use of even better so-called fertility sync timed AI programs. That's absolutely an important tool in the toolkit. Activity monitors to be more efficient about getting semen into cows. And then, the stuff we talked about as well, in terms of management from nutrition and how we manage transition cows and so on. And credit where it's due, the genetics of fertility is such that the heritability is really low, but as geneticists would point out, that doesn't mean we can't make progress. And indeed, there's really good evidence now that, in fact, we, the royal we of the industry, have made progress on the genetics of fertility since about 2010, let's say. So anyway, for all those reasons, I think we're at the point, clearly there's herds now that are not just touching, but maintaining 21-day preg rates for real, with legitimate data, even in large herds, especially in large herds that are up around that 35% mark. Again, I think, once herds are passing 25% into the high 20s, I do think it's fair to say you want to have a sharp pencil on an adult conversation about you're getting into the flatter part of the return curve. So you got to be a little more thoughtful about, what will it take for us to go up another 2 or 3 or 4 points. But yeah, that's, the stretch goal, it probably is in that 35% range. Now, can it go even higher? I to be honest, I think we're really getting into the flat part of the curve. But, let's see. There's still a lot of herds who have some miles to go to go from 20 to 25, let's say, and maybe from 25 to 30, and we can talk after that. But yeah, it's exciting because for the longest time, it seemed like, we're doing all this stuff and repro, but shoot, the population metrics aren't looking like we're making much difference here. But I think we've really broken that log jam in the last 10, 15 years.
So do you think that 35% is still an economic optimum? Because it seems to me that since the 90s, we've come a long way just in terms of our capabilities, and we have a better understanding of these technologies and sensor technologies, and we've really nailed down those synchronization protocols. And it seems that there's been a lot of leaps and bounds made. So do you still think that research that shows 35% is fitting today?
Yes. Again, I would defer to, the people who are really generating those models and may need to test some new inputs to sort of see, even just from a modeling and math standpoint, if in fact those curves shift. But I think the answer is, based on the data available so far, something like that 35% 21-day preg rate is looking like, given today's realistic inputs, even for elite herds, somewhere up around that zone is probably where it's not, maybe not the maximum, but based on today's inputs would be the optimum, looks like. Let me put it this way. If I was working with a herd that was up at that zone, frankly, I'd be saying, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it. And let's go talk about calves or mastitis or...
There's a different bottleneck on that herd.
Yeah, almost certainly. Yeah.
So I want to back up to a couple comments you made earlier. First of all, when we were talking about those predictors, you specifically mentioned treated metritis. And I see a lot of, on farms I've been on and working with some of our vets in our vet school here, there's been a shift to, at least in my perspective, doing less treatment of metritis and being a little bit more hands off with those cows. Maybe if more interventions might be causing more problems. Is that something that's accurate in your perspective? What do you recommend to producers for metritis treatment?
Yeah, so I've got a postdoc looking at some work right now to see if we can do a little bit better screening for early detection, partially based on sensors and data, partially based on looking at cows. We're comparing non-antibiotic treatment, so an NSAID treatment of cows with metritis to traditional antibiotic treatment. So, stay tuned. That can be next year's podcast when I have some results. But I think credit in this area really goes to a group of researchers, grad students, and faculty at University of Florida. So Plibs Galvao, Jose Santos, Ricardo Chabel, Rafael Bissonato, and a number of their grad students over the last several years. They've done, one really large study of metritis treatment that notably had a negative control group in it. So they tried a novel therapy that really didn't work at all. So we'll put that aside. But one of the things that was almost unique was they had a negative control group and an antibiotic treated group. And they've really mined that for some very cool, very informative analyses. And so for me, some of the highlights coming out of that body of work are that although there was some real skepticism about the benefit of treating cows with metritis, because some earlier studies had showed, frankly, pretty small marginal gains from, using a fair bit of antibiotic. But those earlier studies hadn't really followed the cows through to look at culling and milk and repro. They were kind of just, did she get better in the short run? And that was kind of equivocal. So in these more recent studies, the clinical endpoints after, a week after treatment are about the same. That the marginal gain is there, but it's not huge. But to make a long story short, what they've showed is that, yes, on balance, if you had a cow with metritis, meaning fetid discharge between 3 and 10 days postpartum, on average, they are worth treating with antibiotics, because the untreated ones essentially have greater culling and less pregnancy. So approximately 10 percentage points greater culling through lactation, so like 40% instead of 30%, and 10 percentage points less cumulative pregnancy, so 60% instead of 70% of cows that wind up pregnant. And they're getting, it's not just at the end, they're getting pregnant. The treated ones are getting pregnant sooner along the way. So the just forget about it, ignore it, don't bother, don't treat, no. But the other part that they did in one of their additional analyses that I think is really setting us up for where this is going to go next, we can get a little more refined about this. So they looked at a whole bunch of additional blood analyses and cow parameters. And at the end of the day, kind of two stand out. One is really low-hanging fruit, and that's just how many days in milk is the cow at diagnosis. Later is less bad. In fact, untreated cows with metritis, but where the metritis wasn't onset till, 9 days in milk or later, which was actually about 30% of the cases in their study, those cows actually had equally good milk and repro outcomes to healthy cows. So in other words, that needs to be confirmed, but they're candidates to be untreated. Now, stay tuned. I'm not necessarily saying that's to go implement in the fresh pen tomorrow, but it sure looks like that's something that would help us. They also found that cows' blood haptoglobin level at diagnosis had predictive values.
Yep.
Surprise, surprise. If
Yep.
it was lower, surprise, surprise, the case was less bad.
Haptoglobin being, for those who don't know, an inflammation marker. Yeah.
Right. And so it totally makes sense. The trouble is we don't have the little haptometer the way we do for BHB or whatever. That's not a crazy idea to think that one could be made, but not today. And so that's maybe for down the track. So again, all that to say, today's state of the art is that on average, yes, we probably should be treating cows with metritis, but in the not too distant future, we're going to be able to be more selective into cows that, call them resilient or whatever you want to call them, but could safely be left alone because they're kind of on the right side of probabilities. And, back to your original thing, could we overtreat or overdiagnose? Yes. I think what people backed away from somewhat is the lock up every single fresh cow every day for 10 days, take her temperature, reach in her, really go hunting for charge. We don't have good trials to sort of say, if you do all of that, is that too much? I think so. But where do I back it down to and still find that sweet spot of treating those who need it and leaving alone those who can be safely left alone? I think we're still finding our way through that.
Well, yeah, because if you're, you say cows that are diagnosed at later days in milk have a better outcomes, but if you're just not catching them until later days in milk,
exactly,
then that's going to be an issue, right? So is that where sensors come in?
I hope so. I mean, Ricardo Chabel has some really good work that he's published recently. That and there's some work from Cornell, from Matthias Stangafero and Julio Giordano from a number of years ago. That there are detectable differences in activity and rumination of cows that precedes metritis and a bunch of other diseases. Tough, so clear in hindsight,
right,
less clear in real time, day to day, if I'm trying to work the fresh pen right here, right now. But then Ricardo Chabel's analyses also looked not only at, could you use some sensor-based data to identify cows either in addition to or even instead of traditional herdsman monitoring? And the answer there was you could maybe get as good as the presumably skilled herdsman. So perhaps there's an opportunity to save labor. It wasn't better, and it didn't augment. It augmented a little, but not a huge amount. So I think there's still work to be done there. My personal wish or bias is that we're not going to take humans out of the equation with data and sensors, but maybe we can sort and lock up fewer cows and have a shorter list for our precious herds people to deal with, so we don't burn them out and we can get by with fewer of them because there are fewer of them. And then the other piece from Ricardo Chabel's work is that they also found that you could, from metritis forward, you could use some of the same data to predict identify cows that were or weren't likely to respond well to antibiotic therapy. Now, again, I don't think that's at the point of saying, well, given XYZ criterion, sorry, we're going to just, euthanize you or cull you on the spot. I don't think they're saying that. But again, you can pick up or predict differences in how this is going to go. And so I think that, in the future, that kind of, whether we had modified treatment approaches for those cows or endpoints for those cows, I think that whole idea of refinement, just getting a little smarter, more selective, that's absolutely where we're going, especially with metritis, probably with mastitis as well, probably with lameness as well.
So it's not necessarily we're trying to use less labor, we're just trying to be smarter with the labor that we have.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it will be somewhat less labor, but I would say it's better for the cow and for the person not to have to lock up, the entire fresh pen on a large dairy every single day, or at least every cow every day, and just do that really highly repetitive, not super efficient kind of process. I think that's what a lot of herds are already starting to move away from, and we're going to get a lot smarter about how to really do that well.
Yeah, I think there's some human nature that says if checking fresh cows is good, then spending an hour doing it with them is like if we're gonna do it a little bit, we're just gonna go all out and do it all the way, and if we're not gonna do it, we're not gonna do it at all. And maybe there's a Goldilocks example in there somewhere.
Absolutely, I think that's exactly right. Yeah,
not too much, not too little. Yeah. So you also talked a little bit, and I don't want to. We're getting close to time that we might have to wrap up, but I do want to touch back to something that you mentioned earlier about these resilient cows that have higher milk yield. So is it true that cows that are high producing cows are going to be less fertile, or is this something? How do you? There's not a clear relationship there.
Yeah. In a word, no. Or at least in 2 words, not necessarily. That's maybe a little more subtle answer. Not necessarily. So again, we can illustrate that at a certain point there can be and is some physiologic antagonism between the metabolic demands of a high level of lactation and the metabolic demands of fertility. So the classic work from Wisconsin, as cows, they have to eat first to milk. So as they eat more, milk more, have to digest more, their metabolic rate goes up. As a byproduct, every time they pump a liter of blood through their liver, steroids get broken down. And so even though their ovaries are working just fine, the cow ends up experiencing lower levels of estrogen pumping through her veins. Therefore, she's, going to show a less intense heat, maybe not show a heat. She's going to experience less progesterone pumping through her veins, so she's at greater risk of having twins. That's a risk factor for going cystic, ovarian condition, which maybe isn't a big deal, but same thing. So yeah, is there some antagonism? Yes, but not necessarily. I mean, again, if probably, this is anecdotal, but I think it tells a story. Whether you're a farmer, think about yourself, think about a successful farmer you admire. If you're an advisor, think about your best, most successful clients. The elite tend to have it all. Those herds are both high producing and high preg rate herds. In fact, I would argue it's somewhat difficult to have one without the other. Preconditions for both are the same. And in fact, health underlies both. I mean, if we're not getting transition right, you're not getting milk or fertility. If we are getting transition right, you have every reason to think you can and should and will have both. I mean, in fact, at the herd level, there's a number of nice analyses that illustrate just that the correlation is positive. At higher producing herds on average actually have better preg rates. At the cow level, yes, you can find data that kind of cut both ways. But even when you can find some negative correlations, they tend to be of a pretty small magnitude. So for me, the bottom line is it's about what we talked about at the beginning. If we do a good job of supporting the metabolic nutritional management needs of these cows, we can have it all. I call it the triple crown of the trifecta, but health, fertility, and production. And yeah, is that easy? No. Is it possible? Absolutely. And it is not inherently impossible. It's inherently difficult, but it's not inherently impossible at all.
Very good. Well, I think definitely as an industry, we've come a long way. It's going to be really exciting to see in the not too distant future how things are going to continue to evolve. So one of the things that I like talking to my students about is, things that I'm not that far into my career, but things have changed a lot since I was in their seats. And I think things are going to keep evolving rapidly while I continue through my career. And certainly the next generation, it's going to be really important to stay on top of these things, because things they move so fast in today's world. So I'm going to wrap up. We have 3 questions that we ask every guest. And the first question is, what is your favorite dairy-related book or resource?
So I think my favorite dairy resource book is Large Dairy Herd Management textbook.
It's a good one.
I can remember reading I guess it was the first edition, the early 90s edition of that, when I was in vet school and so on. And it's the white one with blue. Yeah. And then obviously there's the new edition that came out a few years ago that's available through ADSA. I mean, that for me is just a gold mine of, it's probably the best one-stop shopping place for both the underlying science in a digestible format, but also the practical applications. And it's, it really is comprehensive, from the big picture of, the environmental impact of dairying to calves, to health, to fertility, to nutrition. So so that's probably my chart topper.
Yeah. And that one, you can download the PDF from the ADSA website, and it's pretty cheap, if I remember right.
Correct. Yeah, it's a bargain.
Yep. And I know I just said how far the industry has come, but that 90s book that I have on the shelf there, it's got a lot of really good basic information in it. And I still lean on that one too, not just the new one. But okay, so what is your favorite book or resource outside of agriculture then?
So one that I'll plug that I read last year maybe is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. It was published a few years ago by a Nobel Prize winning psychologist / behavioral economist named Daniel Kahneman. And I kind of stumbled onto it. I guess you could say it's mostly a book about psychology, how humans think. That's the essence of the book, and this Thinking Fast and Slow is sort of the gist of it. But I found it really fascinating, and also, provided a lot of insights into how other people think. I think it helps with empathy as well, to sort of really give readers an insight, not only into your own thought processes, but into how other people think about, process, make decisions. So whether you're trying to be an advisor, an influencer, or just a good human, that was I found that one, it was enjoyable to read, and lots of things that made you go, yeah, that's really interesting.
I think that's one that I wanted to read for a while and haven't picked it up quite yet, so I'll have to move that higher up on my want to read list.
Yep.
All right, so our last question is, in your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those that are not?
Listening. I think it's for sure as veterinarians, but as other advisors as well, we feel the need to be experts, and that is a need. I mean, we're supposed to be bringing knowledge and skills to the table, whether you're a vet or a nutritionist or a repro advisor or whatever you are. So yeah, you can't just be a nice person. You got to have the goods. But I think what really differentiates those who are most successful is listening. And sometimes, as somebody who's supposed to be coming in as a person with answers, we're not always very good at that. And so either you end up kind of barking up the wrong tree, you're harping on what you want to harp on, but if that's not the client's, the producer's, the owner's goals, well, you could be right, but not relevant, or in a sense means not right in the sense it's not what's not right for right here, right now, kind of thing. So yeah, I think, ask a lot of questions. Many people are decent at that, but actually listen to the answer, as opposed to just be thinking of what's the next question or what's my, reply going to be, like actually taking in, hearing what people are saying about what's bothering them, what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish, and so on. Because then you can, make some goals together, and ultimately you'll make more mileage that way. And I think both sides end up feeling better about the interaction of the relationship as well.
Yeah. All right. So before I let you go, where can people find more information about the work that you're doing?
Yep. So we've got a website which is just dairy@guelph.ca. where we post a lot of links and notifications about not just my group's work, but our big network of people across the University of Guelph. Follow us on Twitter, dairy@guelph.ca. And I have Twitter for myself as well, which is mostly to do with professional stuff coming out of our research group. That's Dairy Research 1, number 1 at the end.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen. It was great to have a chance to talk with you again today and catch up, and looking forward to this podcast coming out. I think we touched on some pretty interesting stuff.
Thanks, Gail. Enjoy talking with you. Take care.
All right. You too.